Hello and welcome to another adventure in Australian literature. It's been a while and I had another book I wanted to bring, but I have not had a lot of time lately, and so I'm bringing this one. I want to bring you David Marr's Killing for Country, but I have not had the time to read that book properly, so it will be coming. Carpentaria is also coming, but time's the big factor. Anyway, what are we doing today? We are having a look at a Kate Grenville. This one, which is called The Idea of Perfection. So that's what we're having a look at today. But first, remember, if you want to support us, there is our shop. We have new book out this past month. Came out in May. The Bonehead Gate, the sequel to the Bonehead Resistance. There are all our other books. There is also our Redbubble shop with over 100 designs on that. On our shop, there are also writing services. Also, please like, subscribe, comment, and share. All of those things help support these videos. So, that being said, let's start with our book. So, this actually fits in. I remembered that we were having a look at sort of Australian country town types of books, and this book fits in with that. Now, the last one we had a look at was, I think, Drylands, and we were also looking at Australian women writers, but the last one we had a look at was Drylands, which was incredibly bleak even for Thea Astley. This one is entirely different. This is from around 2000. I think it's 1999. It's called The Idea of Perfection. And this is set in a country town, but this is not a country town like you would find in a Patrick White, or you would find in Thea Astley, or you would find in Henry Lawson. This is actually, interestingly, this is probably a book that if you have never read Australian writing before, if you have never ever read it before, this would actually probably be a good book to start with. This won the Orange Prize in 2001, which is an English literary award. I think it really pushed Kate Grenville and her reputation well outside of Australia. The other Kate Grenville that we have done is Lillian's Story and Dark Places. I did those two together because they're companion novels. And nowadays, a lot of what Kate Grenville has been doing has been looking at early colonial Australia, telling those stories, starting at the Secret River and further from that. Now, I will eventually bring the Secret River, but not right now. But this one, when you look at what was happening in Australian popular culture in the late 1990s, this book makes quite a bit of sense. This book also is interesting because of the way that it is structured, which is not like a lot of Australian writing. Now, that sounds really absurd, but before I get into the actual structure, what's it about? This is set in the fictional country town of Karakakaruk, which has decided to start a little museum, to bring in the tourists. So they're trying to start a little regional museum. In order to facilitate this, they have invited Harley Savage, who is a quilting expert, to help the little town's cultural association develop and get this museum up and running. The other person in town, because this is a story of two outsiders coming into this town, the other person in this town, and I have to be really careful with this because I want to say Don Cheeseman, and he was a geography teacher when I was at school. Douglas Cheeseman is an engineer, and he is in the town to look at replacing a historic bridge. So this is a historic bridge, an old wooden bridge, like the one on the cover of the book, that is no longer really safe to be driving on and is set to be replaced by a modern bridge. Now, these two outsiders are both people who have come from the city. They've come from, they're in their middle years of life. Harley Savage has had 3 former husbands and a heart attack. And Doug Cheeseman is a very shy man who's also divorced. He's a very quiet man. Is very, very good at engineering. Socially, not so good. Same with Harley, but Harley is a louder, more forceful individual, but still socially pretty, rubbish. And these two outsiders come into this town because they're staying there for a certain amount of time. They're able to come into the town, engage with the town. We get to see the town, and they gravitate towards one another. And it has the quality of the town, the being out in nature is working its healing properties on these two damaged city dwellers. It's a very, very romantic, capital R, romantic concept of rural life, of nature. It's very, very harking towards that sort of attitude. And at the time this was written, the most popular TV show on, I think around at the time, was called Sea Change, and that was about a stressed city woman with her family, her children, going to a rural coastal town to take up a magistrate's job. So she was a high-functioning, high-powered lawyer who then burns out and goes and takes a magistrate's job because she needs a change, and then engages with all the quirky, fun characters. So it's in that vein. And I do not blame at all Kate Grenville of going, hey, look, here is this incredibly popular thing. I want a book that sells. I'm going to tap into that. Lots of people tapped into it. There are a lot of sea change wannabe shows that came out at the same time. These people are more tree changers. That's what we call it when people go out to the country, to rural areas without the sea. So a sea changer goes to the coast, a tree changer goes inland. And it's this idea of small community, living in a small community. I live in a small community is not like this. But it's the same sort of idea that you get from, I have recently been watching Northern Exposure as my comfort show because I've been very busy, and going up to Sicily, Alaska with 800 people is like, yes, I want to do that to unwind of an afternoon or of an evening. The other one I've been watching is Twin Peaks, but I don't think you want to end up in that town. That's a whole different vibe. But that vibe, that idea of, I'll go to a country town and that will solve, I'll join this close-knit community, I will be able to change my life by changing where I live. Sort of the idea of travel, I guess. Not something I've ever really done. I travel between covers rather than geographically, but it's a very popular narrative. Now, Harley and Doug really sit very much in they're already oppositional in terms of he's an engineer come to replace an old bridge. She's for the museum and to cultivate, preservation of the history of a region. So that puts them at odds. This has a certain structure, not a deliberate one-to-one structure, but you get that quality of Pride and Prejudice, the Mr. Darcy and the Elizabeth Bennet. These two opposing people who come to see the value in each other and the value in what the other does. And the idea of a bridge being at the center of this story is very deliberate. Like when you think about a bridge starts over here on either side. You build from either side, so Harley and Doug, and you move and meet in the center, and it's only when they meet in the center that the bridge can hold itself up. So until you hit that center and the forces working on the bridge from either side hold the whole thing up, then it doesn't work. So it's that concept of strength in union rather than individual, because until you get to that point with a bridge, it can fall down, it can fall into the sea, it can fall into whatever it's spanning. I did bridges with a Year 8 class earlier this year. We looked at the Sydney Harbour Bridge and the fact that the whole thing just boom. There's something really satisfying about bridges, actually. Once you start looking at them, it's like, oh wow, this thing that could just, and then it clicks into place, is just, there is something really fascinating, really satisfying about that. Even if you don't fully understand all the engineering, just that concept is really, really satisfying. And that's sort of the central metaphor of this book. These two people with their history and their baggage and their broken bits are able to come together, and it does make it a really satisfying sort of romantic comedy story, because this is a romantic comedy. As I said, this is very, very different from most Australian books. It's a lot sweeter. It's something that is there to be a comfort read, but at the same time, it's not just straight romance, which I would find really boring. It does do things. It's literary fiction still, but it's more, it is sweeter. You don't have the sort of ghastliness that you have in a Patrick White. The ghastliness is part of the Patrick White. Like, I'm not knocking that, but you don't have that. And I think that's what makes it more palatable for an international audience. If you think of most of our Australian books, especially someone like Patrick White, as being like Vegemite, we might get it, but not everyone else does, and don't do too much. The nastiness that we can put into our books is we treat it like Vegemite. You don't put too much, you don't layer it on, you don't eat it with a spoon. That is not exactly palatable for everybody outside. So this one, it's definitely Australian, but it does have more sweetness to it. It's not so bitey. And so I think that this one is one that suits newcomers who are coming from outside the culture. Because there is a big difference between a book that is set in Australia, say for instance, The Red Dog, which is a piece of garbage, sorry, but that is not an Australian novel. That is so not an Australian novel. It doesn't look, sound, taste, doesn't pass the sniff test. It's just no. That's not an Australian novel. This is an Australian novel, but it is not let's just say it's a whisper. There is a whisper of Vegemite on that piece of toast with a ton of butter. So you get a tiny little bit, but you mostly taste butter. I would say that the thing that the death of Harley's third husband, I think is probably your little tiny touch of Vegemite in there, in amongst the butter. I actually, when I read it, it's something that it's like, oh, really? Kate, did you were just rebelling against the fact that you'd made this so sweet. Like, whoa, Kate. Woo. It's a bit excessive. And that is not something that you would find in someone who's not Australian. If she hadn't made it so palatable, I don't think she would have put that in quite that manner. Whereas I think it was possibly her Australian reaction to what was going in, because I will say if you read this, it's like, whoa, that feels out of place. That feels like, whoa, why'd you have to do that, Kate? Oof, bit much there. Because the whole thing really has a Pride and Prejudice quality to it. And I think part of it is Geordie Williamson, who wrote a brilliant book that I would recommend called The Burning Library, and it's about forgotten Australian authors. Geordie Williamson was talking about Australian fiction and the fact that for the first century of Australia's settlement, so up until Federation, Australians really struggled with coming up with a way of telling stories, because our country doesn't do that cute English village vibe. That Victorian realism doesn't work in this country. So the interconnected little villages that you see in like a Jane Austen do not work in this country, because socially that's not how our country is structured, and that those sorts of stories didn't work. It took a long time for Australians to actually find a narrative voice, which is why I don't do old Australian books, because they really are just they're not there yet. It's like looking at something half finished, or struggling to force itself into a shape that it really does not go into. So it's not till you start getting someone like Henry Lawson that you start getting an Australian voice. You see it with Miles Franklin, but it doesn't really, Australian literature doesn't really have its proper solid form till you hit Patrick White. Patrick White is so important because he gave Australian literature its proper locked in place. Hey, that's what will work in this country. This is how you tell an Australian story. And we've been using variations on the elements of Patrick White ever since. This book is more like an English book, which really does make it more accessible for people overseas, but at the same time, it is still recognisably Australian. She's sort of played with that form. You can never get the once we got Patrick White locked in, we can't get the Patrick White out of our literature. It is an integral part now, but she's managed to do this in a fictional town, and I think that's probably one of the most important elements of this. She was able to create the town that would work, whereas someone like Thea Astley is looking at a real country town with the real negative qualities of a country town. Kate Grenville is creating the fantasy. She's creating Pearl Bay. She's creating Sicily, Alaska. Even Twin Peaks is more idealized than the reality. It is Australiana as we would sell it to the tourists. The same way Lynch, a filmmaker like David Lynch, is interested in Americana and then the grubbiness underneath. She's actually selling something that's a bit more Australiana without putting the nasty stuff underneath. It's part of the reason why, if you remember the movie that was made called Australia, by Baz Luhrmann, I think that was a fairly big hit overseas. And it was one of those things where it's like, oh, please. Ugh. Sort of like Crocodile Dundee, all those export versions of ourselves you look at and you feel embarrassed by. She doesn't go that far, but she is tapping into that as well. But it is more the Pearl Bay. It's a fictional town, so you can make it how you want it to be. There's no gothic in this town, because this is not like Wake in Fright, where people go out to the country, see themselves and see the potential monstrosity of themselves. This is a place where people go out to nature to be healed, which is more of a romantic concept of nature. It's not scary nature, it's healing nature. Not a very common theme in Australian writing, because we have more often than not scary nature that will kill you, nature that will show you something hideous in yourself that you've been denying all this time, nature that is threatening and creates threat among the other people because of that extreme interdependence. So it is a very interesting book in that regard. Definitely, if you haven't read Australian literature and it seems a little daunting, this is a good book to go with. Also, Her Ladyship would like it to be known that her copy of Gulliver's Travels did arrive, and that should be the next video that she does. So, until then, and until I bring my next book, bye-bye. If you would like to support this channel, come across to the Black Cockie Press website, www.blackcockiepress.com.au, where you will find books and other writing services to help with your writing.